I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome back to my vampire library. It is a dark and stormy day out today. The rain pours, the sky thunders. A perfect day for staying inside and reading vampire books. Who am I kidding? I never go outside. I was going to wait until after my birthday to share more vampire books with you, but I have received so many vampire books at my P.O. box that my tower of them, which I usually keep right here, was starting to topple. I had to separate it into 3 separate towers, and we're going to talk about these today, and then when my birthday comes around, May 1st, very vampire-y, not, maybe I'll have even more vampire books to share with you later. Arranged by size, because if I don't, the tower will be too top-heavy. We start with some mass market paperbacks. This is 30 Days of Night, Rumors of the Undead by Steve Niles and Jeff Marriott. And 30 Days of Night was originally a comic book, graphic novels from IDW Publishing, as the cover tells me. And I have read the first in the 30 Days of Night graphic novels, and then I watched the movie that was made based on that comic. And I did not think very much of the movie. You can watch that review on this channel. It's many years old by now, but I stand by what I said. I did not very much like that movie, but that's not because the source material was bad. I just didn't like some of the changes they made and the way it used vampires as monsters. But this is a spin-off novel, an original novel set in the terrifying world of the award-winning comic book series 30 Days of Night. So a spin-off, I don't know if it's a sequel or what, but it's a spin-off set in that same world. So the same types of vampires, probably the same midwinter Alaska setting where the sun does not rise so the vampires can just, run free 24 hours a night day. And, spin-off novel. What is it about? Clive Barker says, if you have a taste for the real stuff of horror fiction, you'll find it in 30 Days of Night. He's talking about the graphic novel, not necessarily this book. Yes, Clive Barker thinks those are real vampires. FBI Special Agent Andy Gray used to have a grip on things, but that was before the violent confrontation with the terrifying creature that had once been his former partner and friend turned his world upside down. Now Gray is looking for some answers and finding only more questions, all of which seem to lead straight to the backwater town of Barrow, Alaska, a place that has seen its own share of horror. Andy Gray has no idea what he's gotten himself into, and he's about to find out just how dangerous the stuff of legend can actually be. So it sounds like a new character being put up against the same vampires. I wonder if there's anything interesting and new, or is it just suspense horror again? But now I can read it and find out. Thank you. Some Stephen King. This is a copy of Salem's Lot, with a new introduction by the author. The author being Stephen King. If you are unfamiliar with Stephen King's Salem's Lot, then I would say that you have a lot of vampire knowledge to catch up on. But it is his vampire story. He's done a couple other things that are vampire adjacent, but this is the one that's vampires of Stephen King's bibliography. If you want vampires, this is the one to read. It was one of his earlier books. There's been a couple of cinematic adaptations of it. I have never read it. I do have another copy of it that's one of the big paperbacks, but it doesn't include the new introduction, so I'm very excited to have this copy. I've tried to get my vampire book club to read Salem's Lot with me, but it hasn't won the vote yet. I'm sure it will one of these days because it is one of those seminal works in modern vampire literature that every vampire fan should read, including me, so I will get to it. Also, I've got a copy of Stephen King's collected short stories, Night Shift, which includes a vampire story, among other stories. It includes Jerusalem's Lot, which is connected to the Salem's Lot universe, as well as other vampire stories, I am told by the person who sent this to me, along with other non-vampire stories, but that are equally spooky and scary for Stephen King's work. Stephen King doesn't always tell spooky, scary stories, but I am to understand that this book is spooky, scary stories. Books 1 and 2 in R.L. Stein's Dangerous Girls series. You would know R.L. Stein for his children's book series Goosebumps and his young adult book series Fear Street, which were very popular in the 90s when I was a child and young adult, and I grew up with R.L. Stein. These aren't part of those series, and I am led to believe that they are more mature. I've been told they're a bit racy, which is interesting and fresh for R.L. Stein. So I've got the first book, Dangerous Girls, and its sequel, The Taste of the Night. Beautiful girls, dangerous girls. Destiny Weller and her twin sister Livy are beautiful, smart, and popular. But a summer at Camp Blue Moon changes their lives forever. When they return home from camp, Destiny and Livy exhibit an inhuman craving to drink blood by night, compelled to satisfy their overpowering thirst. Have they turned into vampires? Can they keep their terrifying secret from their family and friends? Can they evade the vampire hunters who are determined to destroy them? Destiny desperately wants to find a way to stop the horror. Livy is intoxicated by her new powers. Will Destiny regain her life only to lose her sister forever? That sounds great. I love vampire stories that are from the vampire's point of view, especially a vampire who's struggling with being a vampire. You know, I like vampires who have fun with being vampires too, but their stories aren't usually as compelling because they've sort of reached the conclusion of their story. They have their happy ending, they're happy vampires. But this is a story about two sisters approaching becoming vampires in very different ways, and I love that dynamic. I love two vampires who have different opposing vampire views, and this time they're sisters, and they're girls, and that's great, because we don't get that very often. This is a short story anthology called The Eternal Kiss, 13 vampire tales of blood and desire, featuring authors you may have heard of, including Libba Bray, Rachel Kane, and Melissa De La Cruz, and more, edited by Tricia Taleb. This is a follow-up to another short story anthology called Kiss Me Deadly, which is 13 Tales of Paranormal Love, which I talked to you about before, which does include some vampire stories, but also other kinds of stories as well. This one is all vampire stories, the full vampire version, The Eternal Kiss. Oh, we also have Holly Black, Sarah Reese Brennan, Cassandra Clare. Lots of people I've heard of in this. Lily St. Crow, all your favorite vampire authors. It's hot, it's irresistible, it's dangerous, it's an eternal kiss. Supernatural forces and desires come alive in these 13 vampire tales. Like love, the adventures are never safe, and hungers never die, and chances are taken. If you are seduced by the mystery of the heart, beating for a destiny unknown, you will helplessly follow the characters in this collection, longing for one to call their own. That rhymed weirdly. But yes, I am seduced by the mystery of the heart, so I'm sure I will follow the characters in this collection. So this is a romance vampire collection featuring, it looks like, nearly entirely female authors. And it was published by RP Teens, so young adult vampire romance. These are 3 separate copies of Carmilla by J. Sheridan Le Fanu, which we have discussed multiple times on this show, but I have expressed that I never owned a copy of the book that was just Carmilla. Usually my copies of Carmilla are part of anthologies because it is such a short story. You see how skinny these books are. They usually don't print it by itself. It's usually more lucrative to print it in collections with other stories. And because it is public domain, anybody can do that. But someone, the same someone, sent me 3 copies of it. So now I have 3 copies of just Carmilla, which is wonderful. She will be on my shelf in a place of honor. And they all have such cool covers. This one, the person who sent it to me said it looked like an Evanescence cover, and I completely agree. It's just the text. It doesn't include any bonus material. If you want a very basic text of Carmilla, this version came out in 2013, so it's been around for a while. Here's a hardcover version. This one's kind of cheaper looking. It's got some very self-published looking font on it, and it's got one of the illustrations from the original Carmilla story just kind of pasted on the cover. Very pixelated looking. I do love this illustration though. But this one has an interesting introduction by the publisher. It says, "This book is a product of its time and does not reflect the same values as it would if it were written today. Parents might wish to discuss with their children how views on race have changed before allowing them to read this classic work." Oh, so it's just apologizing for the racism in Carmilla. And there is some. There's a tiny bit of racism towards the beginning when they're talking about Carmilla's dark-skinned companion. But I was thinking it was going to be talking about all the homophobia and all the lesbian phobia that's in this. But, talk to your children about that too. Not all lesbians are evil vampires. Only the best ones. And this one, which is absolutely my favorite, hardcover with a pretty dust jacket. This was published in the UK, and it says, "The cult classic that inspired Dracula." Yes, it did. Give Carmilla all the due credit. She came first. and Bram Stoker was absolutely inspired by her when he was creating Dracula. I'm not going to read you the summary because we all know the story of Carmilla by now, right? If you don't, you should watch my videos where I read it to you. Yes, I read you this very short book aloud and talk about it and explain things as I read it. It's like an annotated live reading, which is on my channel in a playlist, so you can go watch that if you want to. Children's book called Monsterville by R.A. Noonan. Enter at your own risk. And we have Dracula, or a vampire who looks like Dracula here, drinking a blood Slurpee. There's definitely a 7-Eleven Slurpee. Warning, monsters inside. Monsterville is home to werewolves, mummies, witches, and ghosts. All the creatures nightmares are made of. Close your eyes, cover your face, run as fast as you can. It won't matter. Wherever you go, they will find you. Darcy is having a difficult time in school. In fact, she's failing. So when she and her cousin Sam get into trouble, running away seems like the best solution. Until they find themselves in Monsterville. Interesting that this doesn't mention vampires at all on the back, but there's a vampire on the cover, so I'm going to take it for granted that this has at least one vampire in it, and I hope that Vampire and Darcy have fun together. It is for ages 8 to 12, and it came out in 1995. Good mid-90s, middle grade monsters. Another vampire short story anthology, this one called Eternal, More Love Stories with a Bite. Put together by PC Cast, not the first vampire short story anthology PC Cast has put together. In fact, the introduction, PC Cast starts off by saying, oh boy, here I go, introducing another vampire anthology. This includes such authors you may have heard of as Lily St. Croix, again, Rachel Kane, again. Yes, all our vampire ladies du jour of the 2000s. This came out in 2010, so right during the post-Twilight vampire craze. This is a former library book that was sent to me, so thank you. I'm glad to acquire all the vampire craze books that are no longer wanted by the Boston Public Library. This one I'm very excited about. This is Let the Old Dreams Die by John Lindquist, who I am not pronouncing his name in the proper Swedish fashion, but he is the same author who wrote Let the Right One In, one of my absolute favorite vampire novels of all time. I would say it's in my top 5 vampire novels. Let the Right One In, and The Old Dreams Die is a short story collection of his work, and it includes the sequels to Let the Right One In and Handling the Undead. Short story sequels that follow up with those characters, and you can find out what happened to them after the end of the story. Because Let the Right One In ends with the human little boy going off with the child vampire into an ambiguous and uncertain future. Is he going to end up crazy and dead like the child vampire's previous companion, or is it going to be true love this time? And I've always wanted to get my hands on a copy of this, so thank you for sending it to me. A copy of Dracula. You can never have too many copies of Dracula, besides having a very cool cover. This one also has an introduction by Leonard Woolf and an afterword by Jeffrey Myers. I have the Leonard Woolf annotated Dracula on my shelf, and I wonder if that introduction is pulled from that annotated version or if Leonard Woolf wrote something entirely new for this book. I'm very curious to find out. And with it arrived a copy of Frankenstein with a cover in the same style. This one has an introduction by Douglas Clegg and an afterword by Harold Bloom. So I love that supplementary material that gets put out with new editions of classic novels. These are by Signet Classics, and they came out in 2007. Oh, but the copyright on the introduction by Leonard Woolf is 1992, so it's probably one of his old pieces. But still, nice to put it out there again. And I love books with matching covers. Speaking of which, I now also have the Penguin Classics version of Frankenstein and Dracula matching covers. Hardback with very cool art. Frankenstein has an anatomical hearts on it, and Dracula has some kind of flowers, maybe garlic flowers, just some kind of like old-fashioned wallpaper looking thing. Very pretty. And this edition of Dracula is a revised edition. Revised from what? I'm not sure. But it is edited with an introduction and notes by Maurice Hindle, and it has a preface by Christopher Frayling. The Christopher Frayling, famous for his book Vampires, O with a Y, one of those seminal vampire analysis books that sort of started the modern trend of let's look at Dracula from every possible angle. These are gorgeous with their little ribbons in them to go on my Gothic book collection shelf. Of course, curse you for sending these to me. Now that I have Dracula and Frankenstein, I have to go get all the other Gothic books in this collection. Usually, I look for ones that include Phantom of the Opera. This collection didn't, but it will have Dorian Gray and Jekyll and Hyde and Wuthering Heights and all my other Gothic classic favorites. And then I have my matching little library sets. A Dracula graphic novel. This is retold by Michael Bergen. Full-color graphic novel. Cool illustrations. Illustrated by Jose Alfonso Ocampo Ruiz. This came out in 2008, and as you can see, is a very condensed version of Dracula. It's not very long, but you get the whole story, beginning to end, of Bram Stoker's novel of Dracula. I love illustrated and graphic novel editions of classics, especially those made for children. I have a huge collection of classic novels like Frankenstein, Dracula, Dorian Gray, etc., illustrated or in comic book form for children. Gorgeous. This is Blood Embraced by Courtney Grunholtz, which was sent to me by the author. Thank you. Stefan Bergassi is struggling to come up with a new novel under his pen name, Stefan Bridgerton. His publisher wants something new and exciting, something very personal in spite of his past stories of psychological thrills and sexual themes. The time has come for Stefan to share his story. A story centuries in the making. A tale of love, life, loss, pleasure, and pain that no human could imagine. Only a vampire can know what it's like to be embraced in blood and flesh, to endure an eternal hunger. Stefan is finally ready to reveal his darkest secrets and deepest desires. Are you prepared to hear them? Well, that's cool. So a vampire novelist writing novels that aren't vampire novels now has to write his life story, his vampire life story. The same author also sent me a copy of her Nocturne Masquerades, which she says is 2 books in one. The first book being a werewolf book, but the second book being a vampire book. Got summaries of both on here. So Nocturne is the name of the werewolf book and Masquerade is the name of the vampire book. Amos Dixon invites Cataluna to join him on a trip to New Orleans for the Mardi Gras festivities, and soon his affection for Nancy Richardson, his best friend and Howard's wife, are being noticed by her husband. Tensions between Amos and Howard are only making it that much more difficult for Nancy to contemplate when a strange young man intrudes upon their fun. Laurent Dior is no ordinary man. He is a vampire who holds knowledge of Nancy's deceased mother and soon pulls Cataluna into the gothic underbelly of the Big Easy. Passions blaze and suspicions flare all the more when Howard goes missing and Cataluna is left searching for him. Nancy must untangle a web of desires, mystery, and her own feelings for Amos to find her husband before it's too late. With Howard missing, Amos is left to fight his own inner demons, but will he let them win, if only to get Nancy in his arms? Both of them don't have long to struggle before the evil that is hiding behind the mask of innocence shows its true face and puts all of them in danger. Ooh, New Orleans Mardi Gras set vampire romance story with like a love pentagram. Sounds like fun. This is an ARC copy of Certain Dark Things, which we have already discussed Certain Dark Things, so I won't tell you about the book, but I will tell you that it's very cool to have an ARC. You see an ARC is written on here. An ARC is Advanced Reviewer Copy. So this book was sent to a reviewer to read and review before the book came out, and you cannot buy ARC copies, you cannot sell ARC copies, they are only meant to be free and used for reviewer purposes. So someone had finished with this ARC copy and gave it to me, and it's different from the copy you can buy in stores. It includes the marketing plan, and it has all the new bonus material that was included with the reissue of this book after it came out years ago and then got discontinued and then came out again. So it's cool to have that. Thank you. Love rare finds. A 10th anniversary edition copy of City of Bones by Cassandra Clare, which I have never read. It's not really a vampire story, but it does have vampires in it. And I know in later books in the series, the vampires play a bigger factor. I have not actually read City of Bones or any of the books. I did see the movie, which the vampires were in very briefly. They just the human characters sort of run into vampires and then run away is all I remember of those vampires in that book. It's part of the Shadowhunters series, but this 10th anniversary edition has gilded edges, very beautiful illustrations, lots of pictures, all this bonus stuff. I love fancy editions of books like this. Now I can actually read City of Bones. Any series with vampires in it belongs in the Vampire Library. Damon Volume 2. You recall last time I received Damon Volume 1, the graphic novel. Now I have a Volume 2, which I believe is the complete Damon. I think there were only 2 volumes. Correct me if I'm wrong. Damon is a graphic novel series about the humans who work for vampires during the day to take care of their daytime needs. And then, everything goes wrong. Gaiman expands on the vampire mythos in just the right ways to set itself apart. As the TV trope says, our vampires are different. Now, this is a book that I've been hearing about for a long time from a very good friend of mine who really wanted me to read it and finally just was like, you know what, I'm going to send it to you. So my friend sent me this book. It's called The Oldest Living Vampire Tells All by Joseph Duncan. And this is a self-published novel. It's the first in a series. Joseph Duncan's written a bunch of these oldest living vampire books about this character, who is the oldest living vampire, telling his life story. And my very good friend loves this book and wants me to read it and maybe wants our book club to read it. So I'm going to put this book up for a vote for a book club now that I have it. Even though it is a self-published indie novel, it is a very successful one, so it's very widely available. You'll probably be able to find it easily. I don't often put self-published or indie books up for vote for book club, but for something like this, which is so personal to a friend of mine, and it, was a very successful self-published book, it's something I would make an exception for. Came out in 2010, so it's been around for a while, and the oldest living vampire in history tells all. My legal name, where I currently reside in the city of Liege, Belgium, in the year 2010 AD, is Gasper Valesi. But that is not my real name. The name I was given some 30,000 years ago when I was born in a Paleolithic settlement in the region that is now called Germany. The name my father gave me shortly after I was voided, bloody and howling from my mother's womb, is gone. So begins the saga of the immortal Gone, a 30,000-year-old vampire. This is the first volume of his memoirs, recounts his mortal life in prehistoric Germany alongside his male companion Brulde and his two wives, the Neanderthal Ea and his Cro-Magnon mate Nila, and details the fearsome events that lead to his transformation from man to undying monster. This revised and expanded edition includes more than 30,000 words of new material, adding depth to much-loved characters and more fully realizing the author's vision of the oldest living vampire and the prehistoric world that gave birth to him. By turns beautiful and subversive, poetic and seductive, the oldest living vampire saga is like no other vampire series you've read. Well, that's true. I have never read a book about prehistoric caveman, hunter-gatherer vampires. That really is much older than any other vampire origins I've ever read. And it doesn't even say that he's the oldest vampire ever, just that he's the oldest still living, and he has made it through 30,000 years. So that's a nice thing about self-publishing, is you can put out a book in 2010 and then realize that you could have made it better and put out a new version in 2015, it looks like, the revised version. So this author wrote a bunch of books in this series, decided the first book needed work, went back, revised it, republished it on Amazon. You can do that now. So we have the new and improved revised version, the oldest living vampire in history. Are you intrigued? Now, this book wins the most interesting title award of this stack of books, Amish Vampires in Space by Carrie Neitz. This is another self-published indie novel, and it came out in 2014. Jebediah has a secret that will change his world forever and send his people into space. The Amish world of Alabaster calls upon an ancient promise to escape destruction, then end up on a cargo ship bound for the stars. But they are not the only cargo on board. Some of it is alive, or used to be. Now, with vampires taking over and closing in on the Amish refugees, these simple believers must decide whether their faith depends upon their honored traditions or something even older. This is a brick of a book. This is huge. We've got like 500 pages here. Amish Vampires in Space. The Book of the Vampire by Nigel Suckling. This is an illustrated nonfiction book. It's got some cool black and white art. An examination of the vampire in legend and history, taking Bram Stoker's Dracula as a starting point, since it's mainly responsible for the vampire's modern notoriety. Nigel Suckling examines Dracula's fictional ancestry, as well as the folklore and historical characters, such as Vlad the Impaler and Countess Elizabeth Bathory, that inform Stoker's many-layered monster. The book ends with a look at the vampire legend today and the resurgence of belief in such monsters. Illustrations are by that master of fantasy and science fiction art, Bruce Pennington. So one guy's very long thesis on vampire history. I have no idea whether he is a scholar of note at all. I have not heard of this book or of Nigel Suckling before, so I'm curious to check it out. Speaking of scholars of note, here we have another book by David J. Skal, the preeminent Dracula pop culture scholar of our era. This is Fright Favorites. a book that was put out by Turner Classic Movies, about 31 movies to haunt your Halloween and beyond, including vampire movies. So it's an illustrated companion of 31 different horror movies with commentary by David J. Scull. A compendium of film frights. Fright Favorites spotlights 31 essential films ranging from monster greats to modern and classic horror to family-friendly cinematic treats, complete with reviews, behind-the-scenes stories, and a trove of images. Feature titles include Nosferatu. It's the only vampire one I see, though there's definitely more vampire stuff in here, just from like flipping to the page I saw, like Christopher Lee and Hammer Vampire. And it goes all the way from Nosferatu in 1922 to Get Out, is the most recent horror movie mentioned here, 2017. So a recent book talking about horror through the ages. Just such a glossy and pretty book, too. Love it. Another nonfiction book, Horror, A Literary History, edited by Xavier Aldana Rees from the British Library. So that last nonfiction book was talking about movies. This one is talking about literature. This is the book that horror readers and students need. It will hold you in its grip, leaving you replete with invaluable information about the range, longevity, and mutations of the horror genre as it consistently forces you to engage with serious cultural and personal issues. Well, that's what we're all about here on this Vampire Reviews channel. This groundbreaking book is the first comprehensive history of horror fiction to take readers from the first Gothic novel in 1764 to the New Weird and beyond in the early 21st century. It offers a chronological overview of the genre in fiction and explores its development and mutations over the past 250 years. It also challenges the common misjudgment that horror fiction is necessarily frivolous or dispensable. Leading experts on Gothic and horror literature introduce readers to classics of the genre, as well as exciting texts they may not have encountered before. The topics examined include horror's roots in the Gothic romance and antebellum American fiction, the penny dreadful and sensation novels of the Victorian England, fin de Cecile ghost stories, decadent fiction and the weird, the familial horrors of the Cold War era, the publishing boom of the 1980s, the establishment of contemporary horror auteurs, and the post-millennial zombie trend. So yeah, there's a section on Dracula in here, of course. There's a section on Stephen King with Salem's Lot. And yeah, we got Interview with the Vampire and Anne Rice, my favorite, in here as well. A lot of my nonfiction books about vampire culture and history are rooted in film. So it's great to have one that's focused on literature. Yes, my favorite Gothic literature is my jam. You may think that I'm all about vampires. Nay, I am all about Gothic classic literature. And vampires are just, the best, unless you count Phantom of the Opera. An art book for Midnight Mass, the recent vampire series, written by Abby Bernstein. It's just a bunch of behind the scenes and analyses of the Midnight Mass series. We haven't talked about Midnight Mass yet on this channel, so when I do, I now have this amazing book as a guide. Thank you for saying this to me. I love it. This is gorgeous. Midnight Mass is the chilling limited series created by the new king of horror, Mike Flanagan. An isolated community on Crockett Island welcomes a charismatic and mysterious young priest who performs miraculous events. Spoilers, he's a vampire and is a lot of Catholic and religious vampire mythology and themes are explored in Midnight Mass. Ugh, so gorgeous. Ooh, maps? A copy of Stardust Magazine, it came from the deep. This is focusing on Aquaman and the creature from the Black Lagoon and comparing those kind of aqua horrors. But it does also have a section on Hammer Dracula, a whole spread on Hammer Dracula in it. Thank you, this is gorgeous. A lot of good historical information. And I'm also a fan of the creature from the Black Lagoon. My kind of monster. You thought I'd reach the bottom of the stack? It keeps going. So the rest of these aren't necessarily vampire books, but they are relevant to our spooky Gothic interests. So I am going to mention them because you were so good to send them to me, and I love them all. I'll share them with you very quickly. First, we have the first 3 volumes of the Death Note manga. This is the black edition, so we've got like the black page edges. Gorgeous. I've never read nor watched anything Death Note, so now I can finally experience that because I am all about death, iterations, psychopomps, and grim reapers, and everything in between. 2 more copies of Frankenstein, and this one has this gorgeous peacocky cover with gilded edges and a ribbon inside. Very beautiful. I just love pretty books. This one has illustrations by Bernie Wrightson and an introduction by Stephen King. And I love it because the person who sent it to me just pointed to this picture of the monster attacking his daddy, Frankenstein, and said, all he wants is love. And that's true. All he does want is love. There are some great illustrations in here. Some more gothic classics. We have a Edgar Allan Poe collection by Penguin Classics, including Fall of the House of Usher and other writings. It's nice to have a small copy of Poe because all of my copies of Poe are mostly like complete collections and they're like this big and it's hard and unwieldy to read. So now I've got a nice, compact, easy to read of some of my favorites. A very beautiful copy of The Picture of Dorian Gray with this sort of leather cover. It's got green edges in a very classic style and a little ribbon. Beautiful. I love The Picture of Dorian Gray. Beautiful end papers. Copy of The Turn of the Screw and Other Short Novels by Henry James, another classic of Gothic literature who does not get as much props as Oscar Wilde or Edgar Allan Poe or all of those other ones, but Henry James was right up there writing the Gothic in the era. Favorite, thank you. This is Ghosts, which is a collection of Edith Wharton's short stories, very Gothic, with a preface by the author. These ghost stories are not mere genre, not chills and thrills. They are about the liberty of the form itself. I believe that these macabre stories were, for Edith Wharton, another way out, another departure, and yet another entry into the penetrating observations on the destructive powers of human possession, the aftermath of dispossession, and the haunting power of love. A copy of The Woman in Black by Susan Hill, the classic English ghost story. You may have seen the movie. I have not, and I have not read the book either, so now I finally can. Thank you. This is a short story anthology called When Things Get Dark, edited by Ellen Dalto, which is stories inspired by Shirley Jackson, the Gothic master. It includes a story by Joyce Carol Oates, along with a bunch of other authors of the Gothic, of the modern era you may have heard of. And it's just a really beautiful book. Look at that end paper. Speaking of Joyce Carol Oates, a copy of her book, Them, another exceedingly Gothic story, which I haven't read yet. Thank you. A Neil Gaiman short story collection called Fragile Things, which touts that includes the story How to Talk to Girls at Parties, which is one of his most famous stories. I don't know if this includes any vampire stories. It might. I know he did write some vampire stories, but I don't know them by name. There is one in here called 15 Painted Cards from a Vampire Tarot. I don't know if that is a vampire story, but it has a vampire tarot. And speaking of our dark and spooky friend Neil Gaiman, I also have this book, The Art of Neil Gaiman, the story of the writer, with handwritten notes, drawings, manuscripts, and personal photographs by Haley Campbell, a beautiful illustrated companion to all of Neil Gaiman's work. If you're curious about him as an author, want to learn more about him, gorgeous. Those Across the River by Christopher Bullman, not a vampire story, but a haunting story, very Gothic, I am told. Another book by R.L. Stein, this one from the Fear Street saga, called Betrayal. No vampires, but it does have unspeakable horrors. Good, thank you. He sent me so many books. The Final Child by Fran Dorcott. It's a serial killer story. The graphic novel of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, the Occult Edition. I have not read the graphic novel. I watched the show. I enjoyed the show, but now I have the graphic novel from Archie Comics of The Chilling Adventures of Sabrina, which is a show you may have watched. No vampires, but she is the daughter of Satan, so, there's that. Speaking of randomly Gothic things, I have the Life magazine edition of Sherlock Holmes. Thank you. I love these spooky Life magazine editions that come out now and then. Sherlock Holmes being the premier detective of the Victorian Gothic era, he counts. I always include Sherlock Holmes in my Gothic book collections, even though there is usually nothing speculative involved. But, like Hound of the Baskervilles, you thought there was. So, it still counts. Gothic doesn't always need the supernatural. It can just be the vibe. As well as this very cool art book, The Case Files of Sherlock Holmes, includes removable items of vital evidence from his 6 greatest adventures. I love books with removable items. Look at this. This has postcards and letters and maps and things. I love books like this. Thank you. I also got some movies, including a copy of the Robert Downey Jr. Sherlock Holmes, which I watched when it came out in theaters and really enjoyed. Now I have a copy. Thank you. Some of these are vampire movies. We have a copy of Bram Stoker's Dracula, Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula, but this is the collector's edition, which is very cool. What does this edition include? Oh, 4 brand new documentaries. I don't think I've seen these. I think maybe I've seen one of these documentaries before. Over 30 minutes of newly unearthed deleted scenes, and much more. The Hammer Horror series, an 8-film collection, includes Brides of Dracula, Curse of the Werewolf, The Phantom of the Opera, Paranoiac, The Kiss of the Vampire, Nightmare, Night Creatures, and The Evil of Frankenstein. It's funny, it doesn't include like the first in the series. It's not the original Frankenstein or the original Dracula. It's like the sequels. Except, of course, for Phantom, which had no sequels. You know, Hammer, you could have, but you know, you had to kill him at the end. The film of Stephen King's Dr. Sleep, starring Ewan McGregor. Dr. Sleep is the sequel to The Shining, and I had received the book, Dr. Sleep, recently, and I asked you if I should read The Shining first before I read Dr. Sleep or watch the movie Dr. Sleep. I have watched the film and TV adaptations of The Shining, but I had not actually read the book. So the same person also sent me a copy of the book, a very shiny copy of The Shining. So now I can read The Shining, read Dr. Sleep, and then watch the Dr. Sleep movie. And Dr. Sleep does have vampires. I am told it is a vampire story, not your traditional vampires, a very Stephen King twist on vampires, but Dr. Sleep being a vampire story, whereas The Shining is not. But now the sequel to The Shining has vampire creatures, so The Shining now becomes vampire adjacent. A copy of Horror of Dracula, the original Hammer Dracula film starring Christopher Lee. Like I said, that other Hammer collection I had didn't have this in it, but now I've got it right here. Thank you. This is the legendary 7-hour-long silent film from 1915 called Les Vampires. And it's not about like actual supernatural vampires. It's more about like vampire vibes and vamps, in the sense of like femme fatales. But it is very influential on later vampire cinema, something I always wanted to watch. It's 7 hours long. And this edition has special content too. Very cool. Thank you for saying this to me. I've always wanted to see it. Some other classic Gothic movies. We have An American Werewolf in London, which I have never seen. The werewolf movie from the 1980s. You know how I feel about werewolves, but, I'll watch it anyway because keep your enemies closer. The complete Legacy Collection edition of the Mummy movies, the original 1930s to 50s, all 6 films from the original Legacy of the Mummy. I had never actually watched any of the Mummy movies, but recently I was rereading Anne Rice's book, The Mummy, because there's been sequels that came out 30 years after the original book, and I wanted to read those sequels. So I went back and reread it, and then when I watched this movie and realized just how much of the book was really influenced by the original 1932 movie, it was really cool to see. So, very cool movie. Highly recommend it. I haven't watched the sequels yet, but I did watch the first one so far. I love it. And our fishy friend, the creature from the Black Lagoon. Again, the complete Legacy collection. All 3 films from the original Legacy in the 1950s. Different era of film horror, but still very cool. We love the creature. He just is so misunderstood. And along with this came a couple books. We have The Lady from the Black Lagoon by Mallory O'Meara. The Lost Legacy of Millicent Patrick, who was the designer for the creature of the Black Lagoon and never got much credit for it. So this is a book all about Millicent Patrick and all of the work she did in cinema. And then, of course, the most modern thing to be inspired by the creature of the Black Lagoon, we have the art book for The Shape of Water, the fabulous Guillermo del Toro movie, creating a fairy tale for troubled times. Yes, it was a very metaphorical movie, but this is just some gorgeous art and behind-the-scenes stuff from The Shape of Water. If you like The Gill Man and everything to do with it, all the spin-offs and sequels. We already looked at that magazine that compared the creature from the Black Lagoon to Aquaman. Now we got much more literal comparison, The Shape of Water. He just wants love. Look at this plant I got. It is like a Venus flytrap, Little Shop of Horrors, Audrey 2-esque plant. I love it. It's beautiful. It will sit here on my vampire table. My man-eating plant, my baby. And lastly, and very awesomely, is this Jigsaw Puzzle, The World of Dracula. The art on this is so gorgeous. I know it's hard for you to see, it's so tiny. There's the full image. It's a 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle, which I am very excited to do. It's got Dracula, it's got his brides, it's got Lucy, it's got vampire bats all over. This is such cool art. I can't wait to do this puzzle. Thank you so much. I love it. Early birthday presents for me. Yeah, it's not my birthday for another month yet. Usually I space these books videos out once a quarter because it takes me that long to acquire enough books to talk about. But March was a busy month, so you get another books video. And coming up soon, more vampire reviews. I will be reviewing things more in the classic style of the way I used to make videos more often. Very exciting. If there is a vampire book or movie or puzzle that you would like me to be aware of because I've never mentioned it and you're like, does she even know this exists? You are more than welcome to send a copy of it to my P.O. box. The address is in the description. If you would not like to do that, you could also just leave a comment on this video and tell me about the vampire books or series or shows or whatever that you would like to make me aware of. I always love hearing about new vampire properties or vampire adjacent things or things that inspired vampires. Yes, increase my knowledge. You can never give me enough. Tell me all about it in the comments. Want to hear it. Otherwise, like, subscribe, algorithm, etc., etc. Thank you, and especially thank you to my Patreon patrons who keep this channel alive or undead or whatever we are here on Vampire Reviews. We are not in the grave, and it is all thanks to my wonderful Patreon patrons. I love you. Thank you. And now that the storm, my beautiful storm, is over and the sun has come out, I must retreat to my crypt. So I bid you good night.